Part 1. The autumn rain fell with relentless persistence upon the glass towers of Manhattan, each droplet a messenger of the season's melancholy, drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor with a rhythm that seemed to echo the very pulse of the city below. Alexander Blackwood stood motionless before those vast panes, his silhouette sharp and unyielding against the grey morning light, watching the world below scurry and hustle through their mundane existences, while he remained suspended above it all, untouchable and untouched. At 34, Alexander possessed that rare combination of classical beauty and modern sophistication that graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune with equal frequency. His dark hair, meticulously styled yet appearing effortlessly tousled, framed features that might have been carved by some Renaissance master, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes of such piercing blue that they seemed to see through pretense and artifice with uncomfortable clarity. Yet there was something in those eyes, something that spoke of winters too long endured, of a heart that had learned too well the art of self-preservation. The Blackwood Empire had been built upon the foundations of technological innovation and ruthless business acumen, a monument to the new aristocracy of America, those who had climbed not through birthright, but through brilliance and an almost supernatural understanding of human desire. Alexander had inherited not merely wealth, but the burden of maintaining an empire that employed thousands and influenced millions. He wore his responsibility like armor, polished and impenetrable. "Mr. Blackwood," came the voice of his assistant Margaret, a woman of middle years whose efficiency was matched only by her discretion. "The Delacroix representatives have arrived for the 10 o'clock. He turned from the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command, his movements economical yet somehow theatrical, as if he understood himself to be perpetually on stage. "Send them in, Margaret, and ensure we're not disturbed." The morning proceeded with its usual parade of supplicants and sycophants, each seeking audience with the king of his particular commercial kingdom. Alexander navigated these waters with the skill of one born to power, dispensing decisions with the weight of imperial decree, his word carrying the force to make or destroy fortunes. Yet beneath the surface of his professional demeanor, there stirred a restlessness that had grown more pronounced with each passing season. It was during his lunch hour, though Alexander rarely indulged in such pedestrian activities as actual meals during business hours, that Margaret announced the arrival of the models for the afternoon photo shoot. Blackwood Industries was launching a new line of luxury smart devices, and the marketing department had insisted upon what they termed aspirational imagery. Alexander had reluctantly agreed to personally approve the final selections, a decision he was beginning to regret. They entered his office like a procession of goddesses descended from Mount Olympus, each more stunning than the last. There was Vivian, with her cascading auburn hair and emerald eyes that promised mysteries he had no desire to unravel. Sophia followed, her platinum beauty so perfect it seemed almost artificial, like a painting brought to impossible life. Anastasia moved with the liquid grace of a dancer, her dark hair falling like silk against her olive skin. Each woman was a masterpiece of genetic fortune and careful cultivation, the sort of beauty that stopped traffic and launched careers. Yet, as Alexander observed them with the detached interest of a connoisseur examining fine art, he felt nothing. No quickening of pulse, no stirring of interest beyond the professional. They were beautiful, yes, but their beauty felt hollow, manufactured, as insubstantial as the morning mist that clung to the city's towers before being burned away by the sun. "Mr. Blackwood," Vivian approached with a smile that had graced countless magazine covers, "it's such an honor to be considered for your campaign." He inclined his head with polite acknowledgement, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "The honor is mine, Miss Delacroix. I trust you understand the image we're seeking to project." The conversation that followed was a dance of professional courtesy and subtle negotiation, each model presenting herself as the ideal embodiment of the Blackwood brand. They were accomplished performers, these women, skilled in the art of making themselves indispensable. Yet Alexander found himself curiously unmoved by their practiced charms. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her perfume, something expensive and cloying, wafting across his desk. "I've been following Blackwood Industries for years, Mr. Blackwood. Your vision for the future is absolutely fascinating." "Indeed," he replied, though his tone suggested polite disinterest rather than engagement. "And what aspects of our vision do you find most compelling?" There was a moment's hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in her perfectly composed features, and Alexander knew with the certainty of long experience that her interest extended no further than the substantial fee and publicity the association would bring. Not that he blamed her. In their world, everything was transaction, everything was performance. The afternoon wore on with similar exchanges. Each woman was professionally pleasant, aesthetically perfect, and utterly forgettable. By the time the last model had departed with promises to stay in touch, Alexander felt the familiar weight of ennui settling upon his shoulders like an old, unwelcome coat. Margaret appeared in his doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Shall I inform the marketing department of your selection, sir?" Alexander returned to his position at the window, watching the evening light paint the city in shades of amber and gold. "Tell them I need more time to consider. We'll revisit this next week." In truth, he had no intention of selecting any of them. They were beautiful, certainly, but beauty without substance held no appeal for a man who could purchase almost anything his heart desired. What he sought, though he would not have admitted it even to himself, was something that could not be bought, could not be manufactured, could not be performed for his benefit. The weeks that followed brought more of the same. His social calendar remained full of obligations and opportunities, charity galas, where he wrote checks with the same mechanical precision with which he signed contracts, dinner parties where conversations flowed like expensive wine, but left him feeling parched for something real. He was courted by socialites and actresses, entrepreneurs and artists, each beautiful in their own way, each leaving him feeling more isolated than before. There was the charity auction, where Helena Worthington, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and possessor of the kind of classic beauty that belonged in a Vermeer painting, had made it abundantly clear that her interest in him extended far beyond philanthropy. She was intelligent, accomplished, and would have made a suitable partner by any rational measure, yet when she smiled at him across the candle-lit table, he felt nothing but a vague sense of obligation. At the Metropolitan Opera's opening night, he had been introduced to Isabella Chen, a successful architect whose dark beauty was matched by a mind sharp enough to discuss the philosophical implications of urban development with genuine insight. She was precisely the sort of woman who should have intrigued him, yet their conversation, though intellectually stimulating, left his heart untouched. The pattern repeated itself with depressing regularity. Each woman was remarkable in her own right. Each possessed qualities that any reasonable man would find attractive. Yet Alexander found himself increasingly convinced that whatever capacity he had once possessed for genuine feeling had been systematically eroded by years of carefully constructed emotional distance. Perhaps, he mused during one of his solitary evening walks through Central Park, this was the price of the life he had chosen. To rule an empire required a certain ruthlessness, a willingness to prioritize logic over sentiment, strategy over spontaneity. Perhaps hearts, like muscles, atrophied when left unused for too long. His penthouse apartment, a testament to modern luxury and impeccable taste, had become more mausoleum than home. The carefully curated art collection, the library filled with first editions he no longer had time to read. The kitchen equipped with every conceivable appliance, yet rarely used for anything more elaborate than reheating takeout. All of it spoke to a life lived in service to an image rather than authentic desire. It was during one such evening of solitary contemplation that Margaret had informed him of the latest marketing department initiative. "They're suggesting we try a different approach, sir. Something more authentic, they called it." Alexander had looked up from the quarterly reports he had been reviewing. his expression skeptical. "Define authentic, Margaret." "Real people, sir. Not professional models. They believe it would better reflect the company's commitment to innovation for everyday life." The idea had merit, he supposed, though the cynic in him wondered if authentic had simply become the latest marketing buzzword. Still, if it meant avoiding another parade of professionally beautiful women who saw him as little more than a stepping stone to greater fame or fortune, he was willing to consider it. "Very well," he had said finally, "but I maintain final approval on all selections." Now, as another grey morning painted the city in shades of melancholy, Alexander found himself wondering if anything or anyone could penetrate the carefully constructed fortress he had built around his heart. He had wealth beyond measure, power that most could only dream of, and access to a world of beauty and privilege that remained forever beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Yet standing there in his tower, watching the anonymous masses navigate their small, presumably meaningful lives far below, Alexander Blackwood felt the profound isolation that was the hidden cost of his extraordinary success. He was a king in his commercial kingdom, but like many kings throughout history, he ruled alone, his crown a beautiful burden that set him apart from the very humanity he ostensibly served. The morning stretched before him with its usual promise of meetings and decisions, of problems to be solved and profits to be maximized. Yet somewhere in the depths of his carefully guarded heart, a small voice whispered that perhaps there was more to existence than the relentless pursuit of excellence, more to life than the accumulation of achievements. But that voice was easily silenced by the familiar rhythms of responsibility and routine. After all, Alexander Blackwood was a practical man, and practical men did not indulge in romantic fantasies about transformation and redemption. They simply carried on, one perfectly executed day at a time, building their empires and wearing their loneliness like a badge of honor. The rain continued to fall against his windows, each drop a reminder that even towers of glass and steel could not completely shut out the world beyond. And perhaps, though he did not yet know it, the world beyond was preparing to make its presence known in ways he could never have anticipated. In Part 2, the November wind carried with it the sharp promise of winter, cutting through the streets of Manhattan with an almost personal malice that seemed to seek out every gap in clothing, every exposed inch of skin, as if nature itself were determined to remind the city's inhabitants of their fundamental vulnerability. It was on such a morning that Emma Richardson found herself standing before the imposing glass facade of the Blackwood Industries building, her worn canvas bag slung across her shoulder and a delivery manifest clutched in her gloved hand. At 28, Emma possessed a beauty that was entirely unconscious of itself, the kind that bloomed not from careful cultivation, but from an inner vitality that no amount of artifice could replicate. Her honey-colored hair escaped from its practical ponytail in small, rebellious tendrils that caught the morning light, framed a face that spoke of both determination and gentleness. Her eyes, the color of autumn leaves touched with gold, held depths that suggested experiences beyond her years, not the sophisticated worldliness of society women, but the profound understanding that comes from having navigated genuine hardship with grace intact. She wore the uniform of her calling with unconscious dignity, dark jeans that had seen honest wear, sturdy boots meant for walking rather than display, and a jacket that prioritized warmth over fashion. Yet there was something in the way she carried herself, a natural elegance that no amount of expensive clothing could manufacture, that set her apart from the hurried masses that populated the city's streets. Emma had been working for speedy express delivery for 3 years now, ever since circumstances had forced her to abandon her dreams of finishing her degree in early childhood education. It was honest work, if physically demanding, and it allowed her the flexibility she needed to care for her 5-year-old daughter, Lucy. Each package she delivered, each signature she collected, represented another small step toward the future she was determined to build for them both, a future where dreams deferred need not be dreams destroyed. The Blackwood building rose before her like a monument to ambition realized, its sleek lines and gleaming surfaces speaking a language of success that felt utterly foreign to her own experience. Yet Emma had long ago learned not to be intimidated by such displays of wealth and power. Buildings, no matter how grand, were merely shells. What mattered was the humanity, or lack thereof, that dwelt within them. She pushed through the revolving door with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever duty called her. Her boots clicking against the polished marble floors with a rhythm that seemed almost defiant in its ordinariness. The lobby was a cathedral to modern commerce, all soaring spaces and carefully orchestrated lighting, designed to inspire awe in those who entered. Emma, however, was focused on more practical concerns, namely finding the correct elevator and completing her delivery with the efficiency that had earned her a reputation as one of the company's most reliable couriers. "Excuse me," she addressed the impeccably dressed woman behind the reception desk, her voice carrying the slight breathiness that came from having climbed 3 flights of stairs in the previous building when the elevator had been out of service. "I have a delivery for Mr. Alexander Blackwood, priority package." The receptionist, whose nameplate read Chloe in elegant script, looked up with the kind of professional smile that never quite reached the eyes. Her gaze swept over Emma with the subtle assessment that was second nature to those who served as gatekeepers to the powerful, taking in the practical clothing, the working woman's hand, the absence of any markers that might indicate social significance. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't typically accept deliveries personally," Chloe replied, with the practiced condescension of one accustomed to deflecting the merely ordinary. "I can sign for it on his behalf." Emma consulted her delivery manifest with the thoroughness of someone who took professional pride in following instructions precisely. "I'm sorry, but this requires his personal signature. Priority sender's instructions." She offered an apologetic smile that was entirely genuine, for she understood the complexities that governed the lives of assistants and intermediaries, having occupied similar positions herself. Chloe's smile became marginally less warm. "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood is extremely busy. Perhaps you could return at a more convenient time." It was then that Margaret appeared, descending from the elevator bank with the measured pace of someone for whom every minute was accounted for and allocated. She had observed the interaction from afar, and something in the delivery woman's bearing, a quality of quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it, had caught her experienced attention. "Is there a problem, Chloe?" Margaret inquired, her voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for the unreachable. "A delivery for Mr. Blackwood that apparently requires his personal signature," Chloe replied, her tone suggesting that such requirements were merely the whims of those who failed to understand the natural order of things. Margaret studied Emma with the penetrating gaze of one accustomed to reading character in a glance. What she saw was neither presumption nor entitlement, but simply a working woman attempting to fulfill her professional obligations with grace under pressure. There was something refreshing in such straightforward competence, something that stood in stark contrast to the elaborate machinations that typically characterized interactions in their rarefied world. "Mr. Blackwood is between meetings for the next 10 minutes, Margaret decided. "I believe he can spare a moment for this. Please follow me, Miss Richardson," Emma supplied, shouldering her bag with practiced ease. "Emma Richardson, and thank you. I know this is unusual." They ascended through the building's vertical hierarchy, past floors that hummed with the quiet intensity of serious commerce, where young executives in expensive suits spoke in hushed, urgent tones about markets and margins, acquisitions and innovations. Emma observed it all with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture, noting the subtle signs of status and territory that governed this particular ecosystem. The elevator doors opened directly into the executive suite, revealing a space that managed to be both impressive and somehow austere. The reception area was furnished with pieces that Emma recognized as museum quality, their clean lines and perfect proportions, speaking of taste refined by education and unlimited resources. Yet there was something almost cold in such perfection, as if human warmth had been sacrificed upon the altar of aesthetic achievement. Margaret led her toward a set of double doors that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. "Mr. Blackwood," she announced after a brief knock, "the priority delivery has arrived." The voice that responded was cultured, carrying the kind of accent that spoke of the finest schools and the most exclusive circles, yet touched with something that might have been weariness. "Send them in, Margaret." Emma entered the office with the same unpretentious confidence that had carried her through countless similar encounters, yet even her practical nature could not entirely suppress a moment of awe at the space that revealed itself. The room seemed to exist in a state of suspended magnificence, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that transformed the urban landscape into something approaching art. The furnishing spoke of wealth applied with intelligence rather than ostentation, each piece chosen for its contribution to an overall harmony that was both sophisticated and somehow timeless. And then she saw him, Alexander Blackwood, standing with his back to the door, his silhouette sharp against the morning light that streamed through those magnificent windows. He turned at her entrance, and Emma found herself meeting eyes that seemed to hold the color of winter storms, beautiful and potentially dangerous, set in features that might have belonged to some romantic poet's vision of the ideal man. For a moment, though neither would have admitted it, time seemed to suspend itself in that perfectly appointed room. Alexander, who had grown accustomed to cataloguing and dismissing human beauty with the mechanical precision of long practice, found himself genuinely arrested by what he saw. Here was no carefully constructed perfection, no studied attempt to please or impress, but something far more dangerous to a man who had learned to armor himself against authentic feeling. Emma possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over familiar landscape, transforming the ordinary into something approaching the sublime. There was intelligence in her eyes, yes, but also compassion, humor, and something else, a quality of resilience that spoke of battles fought and won through sheer determination rather than privilege or advantage. "Mr. Blackwood?" Emma's voice carried a slight uncertainty now, for she had observed the intensity of his scrutiny and wondered if she had somehow transgressed against some unspoken protocol of his exalted world. "Yes," he replied, though his voice seemed to come from some great distance. "I understand you have a delivery for me." Emma recovered her professional composure with admirable speed, reaching into her bag to withdraw the package in question. A sleek envelope that bore the mark of one of the city's most prestigious law firms. "Priority delivery. Signature required," she confirmed, producing her electronic tablet with practiced efficiency. "If you could just sign here, please." Alexander approached to accept the tablet, and as he did so, caught the faint scent that surrounded her. Not perfume, but something far more subtle and infinitely more appealing. It was the clean scent of someone who worked honestly for her living, touched with a hint of the vanilla hand cream she used to counteract the drying effects of her outdoor occupation. It was utterly without artifice, and therefore utterly disarming to a man who had grown cynical about all forms of feminine presentation. Their fingers brushed briefly as she handed him the stylus, and Alexander felt something he had not experienced in longer than he cared to calculate. A genuine physical response that had nothing to do with calculation or appropriateness, and everything to do with the primitive recognition of one soul calling to another. Emma, for her part, felt a jolt of awareness that traveled from their point of contact throughout her entire being, leaving her momentarily breathless and confused. "Is everything all right?" Alexander asked, noting the slight flush that had colored her cheeks, the way her breathing had become almost imperceptibly more rapid. "Of course," Emma replied, though her voice carried a slight unsteadiness that belied her words. It's quite a view you have here." Alexander followed her gaze to the windows, seeing his familiar cityscape suddenly through her eyes. Yes, I suppose it is. Do you enjoy your work, Miss Richardson? Seeing the city from ground level, I mean. The question surprised her with its apparent genuineness. In her experience, men of his obvious station rarely expressed interest in the perspectives of working women beyond the most superficial pleasantries. I do, actually. Every delivery is different. Every building has its own personality. You learn things about a place when you have to navigate it on foot, find your way through its less obvious passages. I imagine you would, Alexander mused, and Emma was surprised to detect what seemed like genuine envy in his tone. I fear my perspective has become rather limited. There was something in his voice, a note of what might have been loneliness, that touched something deep within Emma's naturally compassionate heart. For all his obvious success and sophistication, there was something in his manner that reminded her of her daughter when Lucy was trying very hard to be brave about something that frightened her. "Well," she said gently, accepting the tablet back from him, "perspective is something you can change if you want to. It just takes the willingness to walk a different path." The simple profundity of her observation settled between them, like a challenge neither had expected. Alexander found himself studying her face with an intensity that would have been inappropriate with any of the women who typically populated his world, searching for some sign that her apparent sincerity was merely another performance designed for his benefit. Yet everything about her, from the unconscious grace of her movements to the genuine warmth in her eyes, suggested a nature that was incapable of such elaborate deception. "You speak from experience," he observed. Emma's smile carried a hint of sadness that only made it more beautiful. "Life has a way of offering perspective, whether you want it or not. The trick is learning from it, instead of being broken by it. And which have you chosen?" "Learning," she replied without hesitation. "Always learning." Alexander found himself reluctant to see her go, a reluctance that surprised him with its intensity. "Miss Richardson, may I ask, do you ever deliver to other buildings in this district?" Emma consulted her mental map of regular routes with the efficiency of long practice. "Several times a week, usually. The financial district is one of my regular areas." "I see." Alexander paused, seeming to struggle with some internal debate. "Perhaps, if you're ever in the neighborhood and have a moment, you might stop by. I find myself curious about your perspective on urban navigation." The invitation hung between them, surprising them both with its apparent spontaneity. Emma studied his face, searching for the calculation she had learned to expect from men of power, yet finding only what seemed like genuine interest, tempered by an uncertainty that was oddly endearing. That's very kind of you, Mr. Blackwood. Though I should point out that my perspective is probably quite different from what you're accustomed to. Perhaps that's precisely why I find it intriguing," Alexander replied, and Emma was struck by the sincerity in his voice. She shouldered her bag once more, preparing to return to the practical world that awaited her beyond those magnificent windows. "Well, if I'm ever in the area," she began, then paused, struck by an impulse that was entirely unlike her usual careful approach to life. "Mr. Blackwood, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When was the last time you walked somewhere, not in a car or private elevator, but actually walked through the city?" Alexander considered the question with surprising seriousness. "I honestly cannot remember. Years, perhaps." Emma nodded as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. "The city looks very different when you're walking through it instead of above it." Food for thought. And with that, she was gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of that clean, honest scent and a sense of disruption that seemed to linger in the carefully controlled atmosphere of his office like the echo of some long-forgotten song. Alexander remained standing where she had left him, staring at the door through which she had vanished with an intensity that would have alarmed him had he been capable of objective self-observation. For the first time in longer than he could calculate, he had encountered someone who seemed to offer the possibility of genuine connection, not the calculated interest of those who sought his wealth or status, but the simple human recognition of one authentic soul encountering another. The realization both thrilled and terrified him, for it suggested that perhaps his capacity for feeling had not been as thoroughly extinguished as he had believed. And if that were true, then everything about the carefully constructed life he had built might be open to question. Part 3. The days that followed Emma Richardson's brief visit to his office passed with a peculiar quality of restlessness that Alexander found increasingly difficult to ignore. He who had prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to separate the essential from the merely distracting, discovered that her presence, or rather the memory of her presence, had somehow infiltrated the carefully ordered sanctum of his thoughts, with the persistence of music heard in childhood, haunting and inescapable. He found himself drawn repeatedly to the windows of his office, no longer seeing the familiar panorama of glass and steel that had served as the backdrop to his professional triumphs, but instead imagining the streets below as she might see them. Intimate pathways threading between anonymous buildings, each corner offering the possibility of discovery, each block a chapter in the larger story of human ambition and survival that played out daily in the city's sprawling theater. Margaret, whose powers of observation had been honed by decades of managing the complex machinery of his professional life, noted the change in his demeanor with the quiet concern of one who had witnessed the subtle signs that preceded significant shifts in the cosmic order of their shared world. He was distracted during meetings that would normally command his complete attention, his responses to correspondence lacking their customary precision, his decision-making process marked by an uncharacteristic hesitation that spoke of a mind divided against itself. "Sir?" she ventured one grey afternoon as he stood once again at his windows, apparently lost in contemplation of the street scene far below. "The Morrison contracts require your signature, and the board meeting materials need your final review." Alexander turned from his vigil with visible reluctance, as if summoned back from some distant country where time moved according to different laws. "Of course, Margaret, my apologies. I seem to have been wool-gathering." The phrase was so unlike his usual crisp efficiency that Margaret felt compelled to study his profile with renewed attention. In all her years of service, she had never known Alexander Blackwood to engage in anything so frivolous as wool-gathering. He was a man of singular focus, driven by ambitions that left little room for idle speculation or romantic fancy. Yet something had clearly disturbed the equilibrium that had governed his life with such mathematical precision. "Perhaps you would benefit from a change of scenery, sir," she suggested, with the careful diplomacy of one who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of executive psychology. "A brief walk, perhaps, or lunch away from the office." The suggestion struck Alexander with unexpected force, for it echoed advice given by someone whose perspective he found himself valuing far more than professional decorum would typically allow. Emma Richardson's observation about the difference between viewing the city from above and experiencing it at ground level had lodged itself in his consciousness like a splinter, demanding attention he could not afford to give, yet could not bring himself to ignore. "You may be right, Margaret," he said finally, reaching for his coat with a decisiveness that surprised them both. "I believe I shall take lunch elsewhere today. Please reschedule the 2 o'clock with Harrison Industries." Margaret watched with barely concealed amazement as Alexander Blackwood, master of the corporate universe, prepared to venture forth into the common world like some modern Harun al-Rashid, seeking wisdom among his subjects. The sight filled her with equal measures of concern and curiosity, for in all her years of service, she had never known him to deviate from established routine without compelling business justification. The elevator's descent seemed to carry Alexander through layers of his own carefully constructed identity, each floor marking a step away from the rarefied air of executive power towards something more fundamental and infinitely more uncertain. The lobby, which he typically traversed with the purposeful stride of absolute authority, now revealed itself as a space designed to intimidate rather than welcome, its marble surfaces and dramatic lighting creating an atmosphere of cold grandeur that suddenly struck him as deeply inhospitable. The street, when he finally emerged onto its unforgiving surface, assaulted his senses with an immediacy that no amount of observation from his lofty perch could have prepared him for. The sounds, car horns and construction noise, snippets of conversation in a dozen languages, the rhythmic percussion of footsteps on concrete, created a symphony of urban life that was both overwhelming and oddly exhilarating. The smells, too, were a revelation. Exhaust fumes mingled with the aroma of food from vendor carts, the ozone scent of approaching weather, the indefinable but unmistakable odor of a city in constant motion. But it was the people who truly captured his attention, the endless stream of humanity that flowed around him with the purposeful energy of a river seeking the sea. Here were office workers like himself, though occupying lower rungs on the economic ladder, their faces bearing the concentrated expression of those racing against time and circumstance. There were students with their backpacks and earnest conversations, tourists consulting maps, and phones with the bewildered determination of explorers in an alien landscape, elderly couples walking with the measured pace of those who had learned to savor rather than rush. And there were the workers, the true inhabitants of this street-level world that he had observed from such lofty distance. Construction crews in hard hats and safety vests, their movements coordinated by years of practice and mutual dependence. Police officers whose presence seemed to reassure and intimidate in equal measure. Shop clerks and restaurant servers, taxi drivers and bicycle messengers, each playing their part in the vast orchestration of urban existence. Alexander found himself searching the crowd with an intensity that would have embarrassed him had he been capable of such self-awareness, his eyes seeking a particular figure whose honey-colored hair and unconscious grace had somehow imprinted themselves upon his memory with photographic precision. The rational part of his mind recognized the futility of such searching. Manhattan contained millions of souls, and the likelihood of encountering one specific delivery worker in the vast maze of streets and buildings was statistically negligible. Yet hope, that most irrational of human emotions, persisted in defiance of logic and probability. He walked without particular destination, allowing his feet to carry him through neighborhoods he had never explored, despite having lived and worked in the city for more than a decade. Each block revealed new evidence of lives lived on a scale entirely different from his own. Small businesses that had clearly survived through determination rather than venture capital. Apartment buildings whose residents had decorated fire escapes with plants and personal touches that spoke of the human need to create beauty, even in the most utilitarian circumstances. It was while traversing one such neighborhood, its streets lined with the kind of modest establishments that served the city's working population rather than its elite, that Alexander first became aware he was being followed. The sensation was subtle at first, a prickle of awareness that suggested observation without obvious source. His business instincts, honed by years of navigating competitive waters where information was currency and advantage, was everything, caused him to pause and turn, scanning the pedestrian traffic behind him with the careful attention of one accustomed to identifying potential threats. What he saw was not the professional surveillance he might have expected in his world of corporate espionage and hostile takeovers, but something far more ordinary and infinitely more dangerous to his peace of mind. There, perhaps 50 yards behind him, walking with the easy stride of someone entirely at home in her environment, was Emma Richardson. She had not yet noticed him, her attention focused on the small device in her hand that Alexander recognized as a GPS unit, presumably guiding her toward her next delivery destination. She moved through the crowd with an efficiency that spoke of long familiarity with urban navigation, yet there was nothing hurried or mechanical in her progress. Instead, she seemed to genuinely see the world around her, offering brief smiles to familiar faces, pausing to allow an elderly woman with a walker to pass, stopping entirely to help a tourist who appeared confused by the labyrinthine street system. Alexander found himself frozen in a moment of pure indecision that was utterly foreign to his nature. Every instinct, developed through years of careful emotional management, counseled retreat, a swift return to the familiar safety of his office where human interactions could be controlled and their outcomes predicted. Yet something deeper, some long-suppressed part of his nature that had somehow survived the systematic elimination of all inconvenient feeling, urged him forward. The battle between these competing impulses might have continued indefinitely, had not circumstance intervened in the form of a cyclist who, traveling at considerable speed and apparently oblivious to pedestrian traffic, collided with a businessman emerging from a coffee shop, sending both tumbling to the pavement in a confusion of limbs, luggage, and indignant exclamations. Emma, despite being closer to her destination and presumably operating under the time constraints that governed all delivery personnel, immediately abandoned her route to render assistance. Alexander watched, transfixed, as she helped the fallen businessman to his feet, her movements gentle but efficient, her voice carrying clearly across the distance as she inquired about possible injuries with genuine concern, rather than the perfunctory politeness that typically characterized such interactions in the city. The cyclist, apparently uninjured but thoroughly embarrassed, began a stream of apologies that Emma accepted with grace, while simultaneously examining the businessman's torn coat and scattered papers with the practical eye of someone accustomed to solving problems rather than merely observing them. She gathered the documents with careful attention to their proper order, brushing off dirt and moisture with the care one might show precious artifacts, then helped the man organize them in his briefcase with an efficiency that spoke of natural administrative ability. It was while watching this tableau of spontaneous kindness that Alexander made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him mere weeks earlier. Instead of retreating to the familiar fortress of his office, he approached the scene of the accident with the determined stride of a man who had finally chosen action over analysis. "Is everyone all right here?" he inquired, his voice carrying the natural authority that had been trained into him through years of command, yet tempered now with something that might have been genuine concern. Emma looked up at the sound of his voice, her eyes widening with surprise and something else, pleasure perhaps, or merely recognition of an unexpected encounter. "Mr. Blackwood, what brings you to this neighborhood?" "I took your advice," he replied simply, "about walking through the city instead of viewing it from above." The businessman, having recovered both his composure and his possessions, thanked them both with the fervent gratitude of one who had expected indifference and received kindness instead. The cyclist, after determining that no lasting damage had been done to person or property, continued on his way with renewed attention to his surroundings. And Alexander found himself standing on a busy sidewalk with the woman who had somehow managed to disturb his carefully ordered existence simply by being herself, uncertain what protocol governed such encounters, yet determined not to allow the moment to pass without attempting to extend it. "I was just thinking," he said, though the words came out with less confidence than his usual pronouncements, "that perhaps you might join me for coffee. If your schedule permits, that is. I find myself curious about your perspective on urban navigation, as I mentioned." Emma studied his face with the penetrating gaze of one accustomed to reading character in quick assessment, searching for signs of the calculation she had learned to expect from men of obvious wealth and power. Yet what she saw was something unexpected, genuine uncertainty, perhaps even vulnerability, beneath the polished surface of his obvious sophistication. She began, then paused, consulting her delivery device with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom time was quite literally money. "I have about 20 minutes before my next pickup. There's a place around the corner that serves excellent coffee and doesn't charge Manhattan prices." Alexander found himself following her lead, through streets he would never have navigated alone, toward a destination he would never have chosen, in the company of a woman who represented everything his carefully planned life had been designed to avoid. Yet for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the stirring of something that might have been anticipation, rather than mere obligation. The coffee shop Emma selected was the antithesis of the establishments that typically served his social circle, a small, cluttered space where mismatched furniture bore the honest wear of daily use, rather than the calculated distressing of expensive design. The menu, written on a chalkboard in handwriting that suggested personality rather than professional calligraphy, offered choices that prioritized substance over presentation. The clientele appeared to be composed entirely of neighborhood regulars and working people seeking fuel rather than status, their conversations carrying the comfortable intimacy of genuine community. Alexander, who had not entered such an establishment since his university days, found himself oddly charmed by its unpretentious authenticity. Here was a space designed for human connection rather than display, where conversations could unfold without the elaborate choreography required in more exclusive venues. "What would you recommend?" he asked Emma as they approached the counter, genuinely uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. Her smile carried the warmth of someone pleased to serve as guide in her native country. "The house blend is excellent, and Maria makes the best apple cinnamon muffins in the city. Fair warning, though, this isn't the kind of place that does elaborate coffee drinks with Italian names." "House blend sounds perfect," Alexander replied, surprised by how much he meant it. As they settled at a small table near the window, Alexander found himself studying Emma with the intensity of a scholar encountering a previously unknown text. She moved through this environment with the easy confidence of perfect belonging, exchanging friendly greetings with the barista, offering a brief word of encouragement to an elderly gentleman reading a newspaper at the next table, somehow managing to create a small sphere of warmth and connection simply through her presence. "You're very much at home here," he observed. Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, a gesture that struck him as unconsciously graceful, and smiled. "I suppose I am. Lucy and I come here sometimes on weekend mornings. It's one of the few places in the city where you can sit for an hour without feeling like you're being rushed along to make room for the next customer. Lucy, my daughter." The words were spoken with a pride so pure and uncomplicated that it took Alexander's breath away. "She's 5, and she has very strong opinions about coffee shops, pastries, and pretty much everything else." Alexander felt something shift within him at this revelation, though he could not have named precisely what had changed. The fact that Emma was a mother added another layer to her already complex appeal. Here was a woman who had taken on the profound responsibility of shaping another human being, who had made choices and sacrifices that he could barely imagine, yet who carried that burden with such grace that it enhanced rather than diminished her fundamental vitality. "She must be remarkable," he said, and meant it. "She is," Emma replied simply. "Everything I do, every choice I make, is about building a better world for her. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it." The simple profundity of her statement settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to find, connecting their vastly different worlds through the universal language of love and responsibility. Alexander, who had never seriously considered parenthood, found himself trying to imagine what it would mean to love someone so completely that their welfare became the organizing principle of one's entire existence. "And what does Lucy think of your work?" he asked. Emma's laugh was like music in the small, warm space. "She thinks I have the best job in the world because I get to explore the entire city every day. She's made me promise to take her with me on school holidays so she can see all the interesting buildings I described to her. Alexander found himself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. A future urban explorer, perhaps. Perhaps, though knowing Lucy, she'll probably decide she wants to redesign the entire city to be more efficient. She has very strong opinions about traffic patterns for someone who can't yet ride a bike without training wheels. Their conversation continued with an ease that surprised them both, flowing from observations about the city to stories of childhood, from professional challenges to personal dreams, each exchange revealing new facets of compatibility that neither had expected to find. Alexander discovered that Emma possessed not only the practical intelligence required by her work, but also a genuine intellectual curiosity about the world around her, a hunger for learning that had been temporarily deferred but never extinguished. Emma, for her part, found herself increasingly intrigued by the man behind the expensive suit and obvious success. Beneath his polished exterior, she glimpsed someone who seemed genuinely lonely despite his obvious achievements, someone who had perhaps sacrificed personal happiness in service to professional excellence and was only now beginning to question the wisdom of such choices. All too soon, Emma's phone chimed with a reminder that duty called, that the practical world of schedules and deadlines would not accommodate even the most pleasant of interludes indefinitely. "I should go," she said with visible reluctance, "but this has been unexpected in the best possible way." Alexander rose as she did, his movements carrying the unconscious elegance of good breeding, yet his expression bearing a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable in his professional environment. "Miss Richardson, Emma, would it be presumptuous of me to ask if we might do this again?" Emma studied his face, seeing there a mixture of hope and uncertainty that was strangely endearing, coming from a man who presumably commanded vast resources and wielded considerable power. "I'd like that," she said simply, "though I should warn you that my schedule is somewhat less flexible than yours probably is." "I believe I can adapt," Alexander replied, and for the first time in his adult life, he meant it completely. As he watched her disappear into the afternoon crowd, Alexander remained standing outside the small coffee shop, surrounded by the ordinary bustle of a working neighborhood, feeling as though he had just awakened from a long sleep to discover a world far more beautiful and complex than any he had previously imagined. The familiar weight of responsibility still pressed upon his shoulders. The demands of his empire still required his attention, yet something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his existence. For the first time in his carefully planned life, Alexander Blackwood found himself looking forward to uncertainty, to the unpredictable territory that lay beyond the safe boundaries of his previous experience. And if that territory included the possibility of seeing Emma Richardson again, then perhaps the risk would prove worth taking after all. Part 4. The transformation that began with a single cup of coffee in an unremarkable neighborhood cafe continued to unfold in ways that defied Alexander's every attempt at rational analysis. In the days following his encounter with Emma, he found himself subject to impulses that would have seemed not merely foreign, but actively dangerous to the carefully calibrated existence he had constructed over the preceding decade. Where once his morning routine had proceeded with the mechanical precision of clockwork, shower, breakfast consumed while reviewing market reports, arrival at the office precisely at 7:30, he now discovered himself taking circuitous routes to work, walking streets he had never explored, pausing to observe the small dramas of urban life that had previously existed beyond the periphery of his awareness. He began to notice things that his elevated perspective had rendered invisible. The flower vendor who arranged her display with the care of a museum curator, the elderly man who fed pigeons from the same bench each morning with ritualistic devotion, the young mother who sang softly to her baby while waiting for the bus. These observations, which would once have struck him as mere distractions from more important concerns, now seemed to possess a significance that he could not articulate, but could not dismiss. It was as if Emma Richardson's brief presence in his life had somehow adjusted the lens through which he viewed the world, bringing into focus details that had always been there, but which he had lacked the vision to perceive. Margaret, whose powers of observation had been honed by years of managing the complex ecosystem of his professional life, noted these changes with the quiet alarm of a gardener who discovers that her most carefully tended plant has begun to grow in entirely unexpected directions. His punctuality, that cornerstone of executive efficiency, had become subject to mysterious delays. His attention during meetings, once laser-focused and unwavering, now seemed divided, as if some part of his consciousness remained perpetually elsewhere. "Sir," she ventured one morning, as he stood at his customary position before the windows, though his posture lacked its usual commanding certainty, "the quarterly projections require your review, and the Henderson merger documents need your final approval." Alexander turned from his contemplation of the street scene below with visible reluctance, as if summoned back from some distant country where different laws governed the passage of time. "Of course, Margaret, though I wonder, has there been any word from Speedy Express regarding their delivery schedules for this district?" The question struck Margaret with the force of complete novelty, for never in her extensive experience had Alexander Blackwood expressed the slightest interest in the operational details of delivery services. Her response was carefully modulated to conceal her surprise while gathering intelligence about this unexpected development. "I could certainly inquire, sir, though might I ask if there's a particular reason for your interest? If there have been delays or service issues, I could arrange for alternative providers." "No delays," Alexander replied quickly, perhaps too quickly for someone whose interest was purely professional. "I was simply curious about their efficiency metrics for comparative purposes." Margaret accepted this explanation with the diplomatic silence of one who had learned when not to press for additional details, though she filed the information away for future consideration. In her experience, when men of Alexander's station began expressing sudden interest in previously ignored operational details, it was rarely for the reasons they initially articulated. The truth, which Alexander himself was only beginning to acknowledge, was that his newfound fascination with delivery schedules had nothing to do with efficiency metrics and everything to do with the possibility of engineering another encounter with Emma Richardson. The rational part of his mind recognized the futility of such hoping. Manhattan's delivery routes were vast and complex, and the likelihood of their paths crossing again through mere chance was statistically negligible. Yet reason had never been a match for the peculiar form of madness that seemed to have taken possession of his typically orderly thoughts. He found himself lingering in the lobby during hours when deliveries were most common, inventing reasons to visit floors where delivery personnel might have legitimate business, even going so far as to request Margaret to schedule meetings in buildings throughout the financial district that might fall within Emma's regular territory. It was during one such strategically positioned meeting, held in a conference room 3 blocks from his own building, that Alexander's campaign of calculated coincidence finally bore fruit. He was emerging from the elevator, his business concluded and his hopes once again frustrated, when he observed a familiar figure approaching the reception desk with the confident stride of someone entirely at home in her professional environment. Emma Richardson stood before the marble-clad reception area with the same unconscious dignity that had first captured his attention. Her delivery bag positioned with practical efficiency, her manner professional yet somehow warm in its approach to what could have been merely another transactional encounter. She wore the same practical clothing that marked her profession, yet Alexander found himself struck anew by the natural elegance with which she inhabited her role. The way she transformed the mundane act of package delivery into something approaching artistry. "Miss Richardson," he called out, his voice carrying a pleasure that surprised him with its intensity. Emma turned at the sound of her name, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine delight as she recognized him. "Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasant surprise. Are you following me around the city now?" The question was posed with such evident humor that Alexander felt himself relaxing in ways that would have been impossible in his usual social sphere, where every comment carried the weight of potential calculation and every response required careful consideration of its strategic implications. "I had a meeting in the building," he replied, though he could not entirely suppress the smile that threatened to betray the more complex truth. "Though I confess that running into you is considerably more pleasant than most of my professional obligations." Emma completed her delivery with the practiced efficiency that marked all her professional interactions. Yet Alexander noted that she seemed in no hurry to rush away, suggesting that perhaps their encounter was as welcome to her as it was to him. When she rejoined him near the elevators, her expression carried a warmth that seemed to illuminate the sterile corporate environment around them. "Another urban exploration day?" she inquired, referencing their previous conversation with the kind of memory for detail that suggested their encounter had made as lasting an impression on her as it had on him. "In a manner of speaking," Alexander replied, "though I find myself in need of a more experienced guide if I'm to truly understand the city from ground level." "Udi," the words hung between them with a weight that neither had entirely intended, carrying implications that extended far beyond the ostensible topic of urban navigation. Emma studied his face with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to reading character in quick assessment, searching for the calculation she had learned to expect from men of obvious wealth and position. Yet what she saw was something that continued to surprise her, genuine interest tempered by an almost boyish uncertainty that seemed utterly at odds with his obvious sophistication and success. There was something endearing about watching Alexander Blackwood, master of the corporate universe, attempting to navigate the infinitely more complex territory of personal connection. "Well," she said finally, consulting her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom time management was a survival skill, "I have about an hour before my next scheduled pickup. If you're serious about ground-level exploration, I could show you one of my favorite routes through the city." Alexander found himself accepting her offer with an eagerness that would have alarmed him had he been capable of such objective self-analysis. They emerged together onto streets that seemed transformed by her presence, as if her natural warmth had somehow adjusted the quality of light that fell upon the familiar urban landscape. Emma proved to be a guide of exceptional insight, pointing out details that Alexander had never noticed despite years of residence in the city. She showed him the way morning shadows fell between buildings at precisely the right angle to create temporary corridors of cooler air, how to read the subtle signs that indicated which small businesses were neighborhood institutions versus recent arrivals, where to find the best coffee at the most reasonable prices. "You see that building?" she said, indicating a modest structure that Alexander would have dismissed as unremarkable. "The third floor has the most beautiful community garden. Mrs. Chen, who lives there, started it 15 years ago, and now half the building participates. She grows herbs that she shares with the restaurant downstairs, and they give her fresh bread in return." Alexander found himself genuinely fascinated by these glimpses into the informal economy of human kindness that apparently operated parallel to the official commerce that dominated his professional understanding of the city. "How do you know all this?" Emma's smile carried the warmth of someone who had learned to find beauty in the most ordinary circumstances. "When you walk the same routes regularly, you start to notice patterns. People begin to recognize you. And before you know it, you're part of the neighborhood ecosystem. Mrs. Chen always asks about Lucy when I deliver to her building." The mention of her daughter brought a quality of light to Emma's expression that Alexander found profoundly moving. Here was a woman whose entire existence seemed organized around the welfare of another human being, whose every decision was filtered through the lens of maternal responsibility, yet who carried that burden with such grace that it enhanced rather than diminished her fundamental vitality. "Tell me about Lucy," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his interest. Emma's response was immediate and unguarded, her love for her daughter evident in every word as she described a 5-year-old who apparently possessed strong opinions about everything from breakfast cereals to urban planning. She spoke of bedtime stories and scraped knees, of the particular challenges of raising a curious child in a city that could be simultaneously wonderful and dangerous, of dreams deferred but not abandoned. "She wants to be an architect when she grows up," Emma said, her voice carrying a pride so pure it took Alexander's breath away. "Last week she designed what she calls a better playground, with slides that go in spirals and swings that face different directions so children can see everything while they play." Alexander found himself trying to imagine this precocious child, whose creativity was apparently matched only by her confidence in her ability to improve the world around her. "She sounds remarkable." "She is," Emma replied simply. "Everything I do is for her, to give her opportunities I didn't have, to show her that women can be anything they choose to be, to build a foundation that will support whatever dreams she decides to pursue." And the simple profundity of her statement created a moment of silence between them, not awkward but contemplative, as Alexander struggled to comprehend a love so selfless and complete that it had become the organizing principle of another person's entire existence. His own life, built as it was around personal achievement and individual success, suddenly seemed narrow by comparison. "You speak of opportunities you didn't have," he said carefully. "May I ask what you might have chosen differently if circumstances had been otherwise?" Emma's expression grew thoughtful, touched with a melancholy that only made her more beautiful. "I was studying early childhood education before Lucy came along. I had plans to work with children from disadvantaged backgrounds to try to give them the kind of support that could help them break cycles of limitation. Those dreams need not be permanently abandoned," Alexander observed. "Perhaps merely postponed." "Perhaps," Emma agreed, though her tone suggested she was too practical to indulge in wishful thinking. "For now, I focus on the dreams I can actually influence." Lucy's. They had paused beside a small park that Alexander had passed countless times without truly seeing, a modest green space where office workers consumed hasty lunches and parents supervised children at play. Emma settled on a bench with the easy familiarity of someone who understood the value of brief respites from the demands of constant motion. "May I ask you something?" she said, her tone carrying a gentle curiosity that somehow made even personal questions feel safe. Alexander seated himself beside her, acutely aware of the space between them, and the way her presence seemed to create a small sphere of calm in the midst of the city's relentless energy. "Of course. Ibi, what did you dream of becoming when you were Lucy's age?" The question struck him with unexpected force, carrying him back to a time before business plans and profit margins had consumed his imagination, to a child who had possessed hopes that extended beyond the accumulation of wealth and influence. The memory, when it finally surfaced, surprised him with its vividness. "A teacher," he said finally. "I wanted to be a teacher. I had this idea that I could help people understand how things worked, not just facts and figures, but the connections between ideas, the way knowledge could be used to solve problems and improve lives." Emma studied his profile with gentle attention, noting the way his expression had softened with recollection. "What happened to that dream?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching children play on equipment that had been designed with safety rather than imagination as its primary consideration. Life happened, family expectations, economic realities, the assumption that intelligence should be directed toward accumulation rather than education. "But you're still a teacher," Emma observed with insight that caught him off guard. "You've just chosen a different classroom and a different curriculum." The observation was so unexpected so perfectly calibrated to reveal truth he had not recognized himself, that Alexander found himself looking at her with something approaching wonder. Here was a woman who could see past the obvious markers of success to perceive the deeper currents that moved beneath the surface of his carefully constructed identity. "I had never considered it that way," he admitted. "Sometimes we need outside perspective to see ourselves clearly," Emma replied. "You've built something that employs thousands of people, that creates innovations that improve lives. That's a form of teaching, isn't it?" Alexander found himself reconsidering his entire professional existence through this new lens, seeing for the first time how his work might serve purposes beyond mere profit, how his decisions rippled outward to affect the lives of people he would never meet. It was a perspective that transformed his understanding of his own significance, suggesting that perhaps his life had meaning beyond the accumulation of achievement. "You have a remarkable gift," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that would have been impossible in his usual social sphere, "for helping people see possibilities they didn't know existed." Emma's smile was radiant with genuine pleasure. "Lucy would say that's just what friends do for each other." The word friends hung between them with a weight that neither had entirely anticipated, carrying implications that extended far beyond the casual acquaintance they had ostensibly maintained. Yet there was something right about it, something that acknowledged the genuine connection that had developed between them, despite the vast differences in their circumstances. Alexander found himself wondering what it would mean to have Emma Richardson as a friend, to have access to her perspective on a regular basis, to be someone she might call upon when she needed support or guidance. The thought filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the recognition of kindred spirit. Yet beneath that warmth lay deeper currents that he was only beginning to acknowledge, feelings that extended beyond friendship into territory that was both more dangerous and more promising than anything he had previously allowed himself to contemplate. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Blackwood found himself wondering what it might mean to love someone completely, to make another person's welfare as important as his own, to build a life that served purposes beyond individual achievement. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, for it suggested that everything about his carefully constructed existence might be subject to reconsideration. Yet as he sat beside Emma in the small urban park, watching her observe the world around them with such evident appreciation for its beauty and possibility, Alexander found himself thinking that perhaps some changes were worth the risk they entailed. All too soon, Emma's phone chimed with a reminder that duty called, that the practical world of schedules and commitments would not accommodate even the most pleasant of interludes indefinitely. Yet as they parted ways, both carried with them the understanding that something significant had shifted in the architecture of their relationship, that what had begun as chance encounter was evolving into something far more substantial and infinitely more promising. Alexander returned to his office with his mind full of new perspectives and possibilities, his heart lighter than it had been in longer than he could remember. For the first time in his carefully planned life, he found himself looking forward to the uncertainty that lay ahead, to the unpredictable territory that extended beyond the safe boundaries of his previous experience. And if that territory included the possibility of building something lasting with Emma Richardson, then perhaps the greatest risk would be in failing to take it at all. Part 5. The winter that descended upon Manhattan seemed to carry with it a crystalline clarity that transformed the city into something resembling a vast, intricate piece of jewelry, each surface catching and reflecting light in ways that revealed hidden beauty in the most familiar landmarks. For Alexander Blackwood, this seasonal transformation served as an external manifestation of the internal changes that had been gathering force since that first encounter with Emma Richardson in his sterile office tower. The weeks following their park conversation had established a pattern of meetings that defied easy categorization. Too regular to be mere coincidence, too carefully orchestrated to be entirely accidental, yet possessing an organic quality that suggested something deeper than calculated social maneuvering. They had taken to meeting for coffee at the small neighborhood cafe that had become their unofficial headquarters, their conversations ranging across topics that would have seemed impossible to Alexander's former self. Emma had introduced him to her daughter Lucy during one such meeting, an encounter that Alexander had anticipated with the nervous excitement of a man preparing for an examination whose stakes he could not fully calculate. The child who bounded into the cafe on a Saturday morning, her energy barely contained by her small frame, proved to be everything her mother had promised and more, a whirlwind of curiosity and confidence who treated Alexander's obvious wealth and status as interesting but irrelevant details rather than defining characteristics. "Are you the man who lives in the Sky Building?" Lucy had asked, with the directness that was apparently her signature characteristic. Her hazel eyes, so like her mother's, studying Alexander with the intense focus of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. "I work in a very tall building," Alexander had replied carefully, uncertain how to navigate conversation with someone whose worldview was not yet constrained by the elaborate protocols that governed adult interaction. "Mama says you're learning to see the city from the ground instead of from up high," Lucy continued, settling into her chair with the unconscious grace that seemed to be a hereditary trait. "That's smart. You can't really understand anything if you only look at it from one direction." The profound simplicity of this observation, delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty that children brought to their pronouncements about the world, struck Alexander with the force of revelation. Here was wisdom unencumbered by the sophisticated rationalizations that adults used to justify their limitations, truth expressed with a clarity that came from not yet having learned to doubt one's own perceptions. "Your daughter," he had told Emma later, as they walked through the park, while Lucy explored the playground with the systematic thoroughness of an engineer conducting a structural analysis, "is remarkable. She has strong opinions about most things," Emma had replied, with the fond exasperation of a parent who recognized both the blessing and the challenge of raising an independent thinker. "This week she's decided that all office buildings should have gardens on every floor, so people can see something beautiful when they look out their windows." Alexander had found himself genuinely considering the practical implications of Lucy's architectural vision, imagining his own sterile office transformed by the presence of living things, his morning routine enhanced by the responsibility of tending to something that required care rather than merely commanding it. The idea struck him as not merely aesthetically pleasing, but somehow morally necessary, a reminder that human beings were not designed to exist in purely artificial environments. It was during these weeks of deepening connection that Alexander began to understand the true magnitude of the transformation that was occurring within him. What had begun as attraction to Emma's beauty had evolved into something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous to his carefully constructed emotional defenses. He found himself not merely drawn to her physical presence, but genuinely fascinated by her perspectives, hungry for her insights, protective of her well-being in ways that had nothing to do with romantic calculation and everything to do with the recognition of someone whose happiness had somehow become essential to his own. The realization arrived with the devastating clarity of a lightning strike during a board meeting that should have commanded his complete attention. As his colleagues debated quarterly projections and market strategies, Alexander found his thoughts drifting to Emma's observation about the community garden on the third floor, to Lucy's vision of offices enhanced by natural beauty, to the possibility that business success might be measured not merely in profits, but in the contribution to human flourishing. The implications of such thinking were profound and potentially catastrophic for a man whose entire identity had been built upon the foundation of rational self-interest. Yet Alexander discovered that he no longer cared about the potential risks to his carefully accumulated achievements. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what constituted a life worth living, and that shift had Emma Richardson's fingerprints all over it. It was Margaret who finally forced him to confront the reality of his situation, approaching him one December afternoon with the diplomatic directness that had served them both well over the years of their professional partnership. "Sir," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the air of someone preparing for a significant conversation, "might I speak frankly about a matter of some delicacy?" Alexander looked up from the documents he had been reviewing with less than his usual attention, noting the careful formality of her approach. "Of course, Margaret. You know you always may. It has not escaped my notice that your interests have expanded recently to include matters that fall somewhat outside the traditional scope of corporate leadership." The observation was delivered with such exquisite diplomatic precision that Alexander found himself almost smiling, despite the seriousness of the topic. Margaret had always possessed the remarkable ability to discuss the most personal subjects while maintaining the fiction that they were merely matters of professional concern. "I assume you're referring to my newfound appreciation for urban navigation and delivery logistics," he replied, matching her tone of careful neutrality. "Among other things, yes," Margaret confirmed. "Though I might also mention your recent inquiries about educational funding, your sudden interest in workplace environmental design, and your request that I research early childhood development programs in the metropolitan area." Alexander felt the heat of embarrassment color his cheeks as he realized how transparent his preoccupations had become to someone who knew him as well as Margaret did. His attempts at discretion had apparently been less successful than he had imagined. "Your point, Margaret. My point, sir, is that I have worked for you for many years, and I have never seen you happier or more engaged with life than you have been these past few weeks. Whatever or whoever has inspired this transformation, I believe it deserves your serious consideration." The simple directness of her statement cut through the elaborate justifications and rationalizations that Alexander had been constructing around his feelings, forcing him to confront the truth that he had been avoiding with increasing difficulty. He was in love with Emma Richardson, completely, irrevocably, and with a depth of feeling that made all his previous romantic experiences seem like pale rehearsals for the real thing. The admission, even made only to himself, was both liberating and terrifying. Love, as Alexander was beginning to understand, was not merely an emotion, but a complete reorganization of one's priorities, a fundamental shift in the lens through which one viewed all of existence. And if he loved Emma, which he could no longer deny, then everything about his carefully constructed life required reconsideration. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice carrying a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable in any other context, "what would you say if I told you I was considering making some significant changes to my personal circumstances?" Margaret's smile was radiant with the pleasure of someone who had been waiting for precisely this conversation. "I would say it's about time, sir, and I would offer whatever assistance you might require in implementing those changes." The conversation that followed was unlike any Alexander had ever had with his assistant, ranging across topics that included work-life balance, the logistics of supporting another person's dreams, the practical considerations involved in integrating two very different lifestyles, and the profound question of whether love was sufficient foundation for the kind of future he was beginning to envision. Margaret, whose wisdom extended far beyond the merely professional, offered insights that came from years of observing the personal costs of unexamined ambition, the way success could become a prison for those who pursued it at the expense of all other considerations. "Sir," she said, as their conversation drew toward its natural conclusion, "if I may offer one final observation, please. In all the years I have worked for you, I have watched you achieve everything you set out to accomplish. You have built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams, and earned the respect of your peers. Yet until recently, I had never seen you truly happy. Whatever has changed that, whatever has brought light back into your eyes, is worth far more than any business achievement could ever be." That evening, Alexander found himself standing once again at his windows, but for the first time in memory, he was not looking down at the city below. Instead, he was planning, not the strategic calculations that had governed his professional success, but something far more important and infinitely more complex: how to tell Emma Richardson that he loved her, and how to ask if she might consider building a future together. The opportunity arose sooner than he had expected, arriving in the form of a phone call that would have seemed routine under normal circumstances, but which carried profound implications given the new emotional territory he was navigating. Emma called on a Thursday evening, her voice carrying a strain that immediately activated every protective instinct he had discovered he possessed. "Alexander," she said, and he noted that she had begun using his first name naturally, without the formal distance that had initially characterized their interactions. "I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time." "Never," he replied with absolute sincerity. "Is everything all right? You sound troubled." "It's Lucy," Emma said, and Alexander felt his heart contract with concern. "She's been accepted to this wonderful private school. Exactly the kind of place I've dreamed of her attending. But the tuition," her voice trailed off, carrying the weight of dreams deferred by economic reality. Alexander felt a surge of emotion so powerful, it nearly overwhelmed his ability to speak coherently. Here was the woman he loved, struggling with the impossible choices that faced so many parents, sacrificing her own dreams to provide for her daughter's future. The fact that she had called him, had trusted him with her vulnerability, suggested a level of intimacy that made his heart race with possibility. "Emma," he said, his voice gentle with understanding, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. If money were not a consideration, if you could provide Lucy with any educational opportunity you chose, what would that look like?" Emma's laugh was touched with the sadness of someone who had learned not to indulge in impossible fantasies. "Alexander, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept—" "I'm not offering charity," he interrupted, though his tone remained gentle. "I'm asking a question about your dreams for Lucy, because I've come to understand that your dreams matter to me, more than you might imagine." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibilities that neither of them had previously dared to articulate. Alexander waited, his heart pounding with the rhythm of profound hope mixed with the terror of potential rejection. "The Riverside Academy," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a progressive school that focuses on creativity and critical thinking, with small classes and teachers who really know each child. They have an outdoor education program, and they encourage students to develop their own projects based on their interests. It's everything I could want for Lucy, but the tuition is—" She named a figure that would have been negligible for Alexander, but represented an impossible dream for a single mother working as a delivery courier. "And what about you?" Alexander pressed gently. "If Lucy's education was secured, what would you choose for yourself?" I've thought about going back to school," Emma admitted. "Finishing my degree, maybe getting a master's in early childhood development. There's so much I want to learn about helping children reach their potential." Alexander closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty of her dreams and the profound waste represented by circumstances that prevented their realization. Here was a woman whose natural gifts as an educator were being squandered by economic necessity, whose daughter's potential was limited not by ability, but by access to opportunity. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying a weight of decision that would have been recognizable to anyone who had ever negotiated with Alexander Blackwood in his professional capacity. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to really consider your answer. All right, what would you say if I told you that Lucy's education could be secured, that your own dreams could be pursued, and that none of it would represent charity but rather an investment in a future I hope we might build together?" The silence that followed was so complete that Alexander wondered if the connection had been lost. When Emma finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor that suggested she was struggling with emotions too complex for easy expression. "What are you saying, Alexander?" Alexander took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of his entire future. "I'm saying that I love you, Emma. I love you and Lucy and the life you've built together. And I want to be part of it. I want to help make your dreams possible, not because I have the means to do so, but because your happiness has become essential to my own." And the confession hung between them across the electronic distance, carrying implications that would reshape both their lives, regardless of her response. Alexander waited, his heart hammering against his ribs with the desperate rhythm of hope mixed with terror. "Alexander," Emma said finally, her voice thick with tears, "I love you too. I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself that we're too different, that our worlds could never really merge, but Lucy asked me yesterday why I smile differently when I talk about you, and I realized I couldn't answer that question honestly without admitting that you've become important to us, to both of us." Alexander felt tears spring to his eyes, tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming gratitude of someone who had been granted a second chance at happiness. "Then will you consider it? Will you let me love you both, support your dreams, be part of the family you've created?" "Yes," Emma whispered, the word carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Yes, I will." The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night, ranging across practical considerations and emotional revelations, plans for the future and confessions about the past. They spoke of Lucy's reaction to the news, which Emma predicted would be enthusiastic approval, mixed with very specific suggestions about how their new arrangement might be optimized, and of the logistics of merging two very different lifestyles into something that honored both their histories and their hopes. Alexander found himself describing a vision of the future that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Mornings spent helping Lucy with homework before walking her to her new school, evenings dedicated to supporting Emma's studies, weekends exploring the city together as a family, using his resources not to display wealth but to create opportunities for the people he loved. When they finally ended their call, Alexander remained standing at his windows, but the view had been transformed once again. The city below no longer seemed like a kingdom over which he ruled in splendid isolation, but rather a community of which he was finally truly part. The lights in the apartments and offices no longer represented anonymous others pursuing their small, presumably meaningless lives, but rather neighbors and fellow travelers, each with their own dreams and struggles and moments of joy. 3 months later, on a spring morning that seemed to pulse with the promise of new beginnings, Alexander stood in a small chapel surrounded by the people who had come to matter most to him in the world. Emma moved toward him down the simple aisle with Lucy at her side, both of them radiant with happiness that seemed to illuminate the modest space more effectively than any amount of expensive lighting could have managed. As he took Emma's hands in his own, Alexander reflected on the transformation that had brought him to this moment, how a single delivery had somehow delivered him from the prison of his own making, how love had taught him to see the world through new eyes, how the courage to risk everything he thought he wanted had given him everything he had never known he needed. Lucy, who had appointed herself the unofficial coordinator of the proceedings, looked up at him with the serious expression she reserved for matters of particular importance. "Alexander," she said, in the stage whisper that was apparently her version of discretion, "you have to promise to take care of Mama and help her with her dreams." "I promise," Alexander replied, his voice carrying the solemnity of a sacred vow. "And you have to promise to help me design better buildings when I grow up." "I promise that too." Lucy nodded with satisfaction, apparently considering her responsibilities as family negotiator successfully completed. "Good, now you can kiss her." And as Alexander bent to kiss his bride, Surrounded by the laughter of their small gathering of family and friends, he understood finally that the greatest empire he could ever hope to rule was the one built not from ambition and acquisition, but from love, freely given and gratefully received. The view from the ground, as Emma had taught him, was indeed far more beautiful than any perspective his tower could have provided. In the months and years that followed, Alexander would continue to lead Blackwood Industries with the same intelligence and dedication that had built the company into a force for innovation and progress. But his definition of success had been fundamentally altered by the love of a delivery woman who had shown him that the most valuable things in life could not be purchased, only earned through the patient cultivation of genuine human connection. And if sometimes, during board meetings or strategic planning sessions, his thoughts drifted to Lucy's latest architectural innovations or Emma's insights about child development, his colleagues learned to recognize these moments not as distractions from important business, but as evidence that their leader had finally discovered what truly mattered in a life well lived. The towers of Manhattan continued to reach toward the sky with their old ambition, but Alexander Blackwood had learned at last that the most important journeys were those that brought you home to the people you loved, and that the greatest achievements were measured not in profits or power, but in the simple daily miracle of building a life that honored both your dreams and your deepest commitments to those who depended on your love. Emma Richardson Blackwood had taught him that lesson with the patient grace of someone who had always understood that the most valuable treasures were often delivered not in expensive packages, but in the form of second chances offered by ordinary people with extraordinary hearts. And for the rest of his days, Alexander would consider himself the recipient of the most important delivery of his life.